Montana Territory, late spring of 1872, clouds hung heavy over the high plains as thunder rolled far off in the distance. The baby came faster than she expected, and there was no one around but the wind. Della Trenton staggered through the tall grass, one arm pressed to her swollen belly, the other gripping the strap of her satchel. Her boots were soaked from crossing the creek that morning, and her breath came sharp and fast. She had not planned for this. She thought she had more time. But her body had taken over, and now the contractions were hitting hard, close together. The wagon she'd been traveling in tipped into a gully 2 days ago, horses spooked and lost. The driver, a hired man from Fort Benton, had not survived the fall. She had crawled out with a twisted ankle and a handful of supplies. No one knew she was out here. No one was coming. She dropped to her knees in the clearing, the sun breaking through the clouds just long enough to touch her face. She was 21, alone, and about to bring life into the world with nothing but a tin of boiled water and the fire inside her heart. She cried out once, then bit down on her sleeve. She would not die here. Larsen Shaw guided his horse along the rise above the river, scanning the open land for signs of strays. He was driving cattle south when the storm passed through and scattered the herd. He had been riding hard since dawn. The leather of his coat was stiff from old rain, and dust clung to his boots. He caught the sound faintly at first, something sharp on the wind that did not belong. He reined in, listening, another cry, then silence. He turned his horse toward it. Larsen reached the field just as the sun slipped behind the clouds again. There, in the tall grass, was a woman lying on her side, her dress soaked, her face pale and streaked with sweat. A newborn lay against her chest, red and wrinkled, still slick with birth. "Ma'am," he said, stepping down fast. "Are you hurt?" Her eyes fluttered open. "The baby, please." He did not hesitate. He dropped to his knees beside her, pulling off his saddle blanket. It was thick and warm, lined with wool, and he wrapped it around both of them carefully, tucking it under her back and over the baby. The child let out a weak cry, and Della's arms tightened. "You're safe now," Larsen said, voice low. "I've got you." She blinked slowly, lips trembling. "Who are you?" Larsen Shaw, cowboy out of White Rock. "You and your baby are not dying out here." Her hand gripped his coat sleeve. "I thought I would." He looked down at her face, dirt-smudged, tear-streaked, but beautiful in a way that made his chest ache. "Not today." He built a fire just beyond the field, under a stand of cottonwoods. He gathered her and the baby in his arms and carried them there, setting them down gently on a bed of pine boughs. The baby, small, dark-haired, and quiet, slept against her chest. Della's hands shook as she took a sip of water from his canteen. "Thank you," she whispered. "You do not need to thank me," he said. She looked up at him, studying his face. Sun-weathered skin, brown hair curling at the temples, a strong jaw that set tight when he was thinking. He could not have been much older than her, 25, maybe 26. "Where were you headed?" he asked, crouching beside her. "Helena," she said. "My uncle has a farm near there. My parents died last winter and I did not have anywhere else to go." Larsen nodded slowly. "That is a long ride from here." "I was with a wagon. It went over. The driver, he did not survive." "How long have you been on your own?" "2 nights. I thought I had more time before she came." He asked, raising a brow. Della smiled faintly, brushing a finger along the baby's cheek. "Her name is Zadie." Larsen's throat tightened. He had seen death on the plains, had dug graves in frozen earth and watched men bleed out in the dirt. But nothing shook him like the sight of this woman, this baby, alive in his arms under a rattling sky. He swallowed hard. "She is beautiful." Della looked at him then, really looked, and something in her chest shifted. By nightfall, the fire was steady and the storm had passed. Larsen gave Della the last of his jerky and boiled water for her in a tin cup. Zadie slept tucked inside the saddle blanket, her tiny fingers curled against her mother's skin. "Why were you out here?" Della asked, voice soft. "Lost a few steers in the storm. Thought I saw tracks heading this way." She studied him in the firelight. "You saved us." "I only did what anyone should." "Still," she said, her hand brushing his as he passed her the cup. You came, Larsen met her eyes. I would come again, every time. The silence between them stretched, warm and full. Della leaned back against the tree, her eyes fluttering shut for a moment. Zadie stirred, then settled again. Larsen sat nearby, feeding the fire. He watched the slow rise and fall of Della's chest, the way her arms curled protectively around the baby. Something inside him settled, like a coin dropped into the bottom of a well. He had never believed in fate. But tonight, under a sky full of stars and smoke, he started to. By morning, Della could stand with help. Her ankle was stiff, but she wrapped it tight with cloth and leaned on Larsen's shoulder. He helped her onto his horse, then climbed up behind her, cradling Zadie in his arms. They rode slow, following the river south. Della leaned back into his chest, her head resting against his collarbone. She felt safe there, and more than that, she felt wanted. You do not have to take me all the way to Helena, she said after a while. I know I do not, Larsen replied, but I am going to. She turned her head slightly to look up at him. Why? His voice was quiet. Because I want to, Della smiled, her eyes soft. You are not what I expected, Larsen Shaw. He leaned down, brushing his lips against her temple. Neither are you, Della Trenton. And the wind carried them forward, horse hooves steady beneath them, hearts beginning to beat in time. The trail narrowed as they moved into the foothills, tall lodgepole pines closing in on either side. The river had dropped out of sight, replaced by the steady hush of wind through needles and the occasional rustle of grouse fleeing their passage. Larsen kept the horse at a gentle pace, mindful of Della's still healing ankle and the fragile bundle cradled in her arms. Zadie slept soundly, her breath warm against Della's collarbone. They passed no one for 3 days. Each night, Larsen gathered wood and started a fire low and steady. He set Della down on folded canvas, close enough to the warmth to ease her stiffness, but far enough from the smoke to keep Zadie undisturbed. He cooked beans in his tin pot, sometimes adding a bit of dried onion or a sliver of salt pork when she seemed able to keep it down. She ate slowly, her appetite returning day by day. On the 4th evening, Della sat with her legs tucked beneath her, Zadie nursing quietly beneath her shawl. The air was cool, and the stars showed early through the pine branches overhead. Larsen sat across from her, sharpening his knife along a smooth stone, the rhythm slow and even. What was she like? Della asked, voice almost lost in the fire's crackle. He looked up, the blade paused mid-stroke. Who? Your mother. He rested the knife across his knee. She was precise. Not cold, just exacting. She stitched seemed so straight you'd think she measured them with a ruler, though she never owned one. She taught me to mend before I could ride. Della smiled faintly. Mine played piano, not very well, but she tried. She used to hum the parts she couldn't play. Do you play? She shook her head. No piano in the house after the fever took my father, couldn't afford to keep it. My uncle sold it while I was still in bed. Larsen didn't speak, but his gaze stayed steady on her. She felt it, not pity, not discomfort, just presence. It was the first time in weeks she hadn't felt like she was disappearing. I thought I'd feel more like a mother when she came, Della said, adjusting Zadie's shawl gently, but I still feel like me. Just with more to lose. Larsen leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. You haven't lost her, no, but I almost did, and that doesn't leave you, not all at once. He nodded once, and the firelight caught the edge of his jaw. Maybe it's not about feeling like a mother. Maybe it's about doing it anyway. Della looked down at her daughter, her lips pressed to Zadie's fine hair. I'm scared. That means you're watching close, he said. That's the right kind of fear. She looked up, eyes shining with quiet exhaustion. And you? What are you afraid of? He didn't answer right away. The fire popped, sending up a brief scatter of sparks. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. Becoming like my father. He walked away from us when I was 8, left my mother with debts and a boy she couldn't feed. Haven't seen him since. Della's chest tightened. Is that why you stayed with me? No, he said. I stayed because I wanted to. I don't leave people in the dirt. Zadie stirred, her small mouth seeking. Della adjusted her against her shoulder, rocking gently. You could have ridden on, she said. I thought about it, but something held me back. He looked at her then, not just her face, but all of her steadiness, the grace that showed even in fatigue. You, she didn't speak, but she reached across the space between them and set her hand on his knee. Her fingers were cold. The next morning, Larsen saddled the horse in silence while Della packed their few belongings. Zadie was wrapped snugly against her chest, her tiny breaths barely stirring the linen. As they rode, Della leaned more easily against him now, her body learning the rhythm of the trail. They passed a narrow ravine around noon where a wooden cross leaned half-collapsed beside an old trail marker. Della's voice was quiet. Someone buried him. Looks like, Larsen said. I hope someone buries me if it comes to that. He didn't answer. He just pulled her closer with the arm around her waist. That evening, they found a patch of flat earth near the edge of a dry arroyo. Della gathered kindling while Larsen dug a small trench for the fire. She moved slower than she used to, but she moved. As night settled, the air turned sharp. Della pulled her coat tighter and sat close to Larsen, Zadie resting between them. I never asked, she said, her voice carrying warmth beneath the chill. Why are you still out here? Why not settle somewhere? I tried once, he said. Bought a small claim near Deer Lodge, put up a fence, started clearing land. He looked into the fire. Didn't last. Winter took the cattle. Fire took the house. I'm sorry, he shrugged, but there was no indifference in it. I was alone. It was easier to ride again. She studied his profile. You're not alone now. No, he said, turning to her. I'm not. Zadie shifted, her tiny hand reaching out blindly. Larsen caught it with one finger and the baby's grip closed around it. His breath hitched once, barely audible. Della saw it, and the warmth in her chest grew so full she had to close her eyes a moment to bear it. They slept close that night, Della curled against Larsen's side, Zadie nestled between them. The fire burned low. The wind moved through the trees above, but down on the ground, there was only stillness. In the morning, they would keep riding. But tonight, they had everything they needed. They reached the edge of Helena just as the sun slipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the cottonwoods. The town was quieting for evening shutters drawn, smoke curling from chimneys, the occasional dog barking in the distance. Larsen guided the horse down the main road, his arm around Della's waist, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. Zadie was tucked close in her arms, wrapped in a wool shawl Della had sewn from a torn underskirt 2 nights back. The land had changed as they'd gone south, more fences, more trees, more signs of hands shaping the wild. But Della hadn't said much as they neared her uncle's land. Her breathing had grown shallow, and Larsen had felt the shift in her, like something in her chest braced against what came next. He stopped the horse outside a whitewashed gate. The house beyond it was simple but well kept, with a hand-carved porch rail and a split-rail corral standing empty. No smoke came from the chimney. Is this it? He asked. She nodded, then stepped down with a wince, cradling Zadie close. Larsen dismounted beside her, watching her face. Her mouth was tight, eyes fixed on the house. You want me to go up with you? She hesitated. He hasn't seen me in 2 years. Last letter I sent, I was still engaged. Larsen didn't push. He waited, hands loose at his sides. Della looked at him then, her gaze steady. Stay close. The porch boards gave slightly under her weight. She knocked once, soft but firm. After a moment, the door creaked open. The man who answered had a thick gray beard and a long scar down the left side of his neck. He blinked at her, then frowned. Della. Yes, Uncle Merritt. His eyes dropped to Zadie, then flicked past her to Larsen. You look like your mother, he said. I need a place for a while. Just a while. He stepped back without a word, holding the door open. Inside, the room smelled of pipe smoke and old books. A kettle sat cold on the stove, and a rifle leaned against the far wall. Della stood just inside the doorway, her back straight. You can take the spare room, Merritt said. The bed hasn't been used in months. She nodded, then glanced over her shoulder. Larsen's been riding with me. He's the reason we made it. Merritt gave a single nod. There's a cot in the loft. He can use it. Larsen didn't speak, just touched the brim of his hat once in respect. That night, Larsen sat in the loft's low rafters listening to the wind shift outside. The cot creaked beneath him. Below, the house was still. Della hadn't come out after supper. She'd taken Zadie to the room and stayed there. He lay back, staring at the beams above. The air smelled of pine tar and dust. He wasn't sure whether he'd be riding out in the morning or staying on to fix fence posts or chop wood. Either one, he'd do it if she asked. But he wanted her to ask. In the morning, he found her outside hanging linens on a line that sagged toward the garden. Zadie was strapped against her front, asleep again. "Sleep well?" he asked. She didn't look at him right away. "She woke once. I walked the floor with her." "You look steady on your feet. I'm getting there." Larsen leaned against the fence. "Your uncle's quiet. He's a widower. Doesn't say much unless it's about mending tools." He studied her hands as she pinned the cloth to the line-thin wrists, a red mark just beneath one cuff. "You could stay here," he said finally. "I mean, if you want to." Della turned then, slowly. "That sounds like you're leaving." "I don't want to, Della, but I don't want to press where I'm not welcome." She stepped closer, eyes never leaving his. "You think I'd have survived out there without you?" He shook his head, but she cut him off. "I don't mean because of the cold or the hunger or the wolves. I mean the quiet, the kind that gets inside your bones." Her voice caught and she looked down. Larsen reached for her hand, dirt under her nails and all. "I told you I'd come again," he said. "That ain't changed." She looked up and her fingers tightened around his. "I want a life that feels like something," she said. "Not just surviving day to day. I want her to grow up knowing what steadiness looks like." He nodded, his voice roughening. "Then I'll build it with you." Zadie stirred, and Della shifted her weight, cradling the baby close with one hand and holding Larsen's with the other. They stood like that while the wind moved gently through the orchard trees, and somewhere nearby a rooster called once, clear and sharp. Later that week, Merritt asked him to stay on for the spring planting. Then summer passed, and the house filled with quiet laughter and the scent of baking bread. Della moved lighter through the rooms. Larsen built a cradle from juniper wood, each joint carved by hand. By the first frost, he asked her to marry him. She didn't answer with words, just stepped into his arms and held him close enough he could feel every breath she took. They were married beneath the cottonwoods in early November. Snow dusted the branches, and Zadie wore a knitted bonnet Della had made by firelight. Larsen wrapped them both in his old saddle blanket as they walked back to the house, the same one he'd used that first night in the field. It was worn now, patched and faded but full of memory. "I like the weight of it," Della said, her head against his shoulder. "So do I," he whispered, holding them both as the wind settled and the light turned gold over the hills. The days shortened. Snow clung to the north edge of the fence rails and settled in shallow drifts beside the barn. A lean wind came down from the mountains in the evenings, sharp enough to sting the skin. But the house stayed warm from the stove. Merritt had moved into the front room before the first snowfall. Zadie had taken to crawling slow, determined shuffles across the braided rug, and her gums showed the first sign of teeth, which kept Della up most nights and made her laugh in the mornings, bleary-eyed and barefoot in the kitchen. Larsen kept close to the land. He split wood with practiced rhythm, built up the root cellar with logs and stones to keep it from leaking, and mended the shed roof with salvaged planks. Della watched him from the window sometimes, Zadie against her hip, and felt the strange, anchoring wonder of a life that was no longer temporary. One afternoon, while the wind held steady and the sun stayed soft and low, Merritt limped out across the yard with 2 tin mugs and a flask of corn whiskey. He handed one mug to Larsen without comment and sat on the stump near the fence, shifting carefully to ease his bad knee. "You ever worked oxen?" Merritt asked after a quiet minute. "No," Larsen said, "but I can learn." Merritt nodded. "Thinking to get a pair in spring. Been years since I broke a yoke team, but the soil back there's stubborn as sin. Wouldn't hurt to have stronger pull." "I'll help you raise the pen," Larsen said. Merritt took a sip, then looked out toward the slope where the orchard met the woodline. "She's steadier with you around," he said, voice even. When she came here, I wasn't sure she had anything left in her. Larsen didn't answer at first. The wind moved through the dry stalks of last season's corn, brittle and thin where they still stood. I didn't do anything remarkable, Larsen said at last. She did the hard part. You stayed. Larsen nodded once. I'll keep doing that. The next morning, Della found Larsen at the shed, sleeves rolled, sawdust on his shoulders. She stepped inside, Zadie asleep in the sling across her chest. Your hands are shaking, she said, noticing the way he rested the saw after each few strokes. Bit of a fever, he admitted, voice low. You should be in bed. He wiped his brow with a rag. Too much to do? She crossed to him and reached for his hand. It can wait. He looked at her then, the stubbornness in his jaw giving way to something gentler. Only if you sit with me. They walked back to the house together, slow and quiet, Della's arm wrapped around his waist. She made him lay on the dabe near the stove while she brewed willow bark in a chipped blue pot. He dozed while it steeped, and when he woke again, she was sitting nearby, mending one of his shirts with careful stitches, her needle glinting in the firelight. You always this good with thread? He asked, voice hoarse. No, she said, but I've gotten better. He watched her for a while, the soft line of her profile, the way her fingers moved with simple precision. What did you think your life would be before everything? She didn't look up. I thought I'd be a teacher or maybe a postmistress. Her smile was faint. Somewhere quiet where I could read in the afternoons and bake bread with no one watching. You still could. She tied off a seam. Maybe, but I think I like this more. Zadie stirred in the cradle beside the stove. Della reached down and touched her shoulder lightly, settling her back into sleep. You never say much about what you want, she said, only what you'll do. Larsen folded his hands across his chest. I want to raise her with you, that's it. Della met his eyes. That's not a small thing. No, he said. It ain't. That evening, the fever broke. Della made a broth from marrow bones and wild onion, and Larsen sat up to drink it, wrapped in the wool blanket she'd quilted with Merritt's old shirts. Zadie reached for his fingers while he ate, and he let her pull at them, her grip stronger than it had been the week before. Later, as Della carried Zadie toward the back room, Larsen spoke without raising his voice. When spring comes, I want to build her a swing. Della paused in the doorway. A swing? From the oak out front, just a plank and rope, something she can grow into. Della turned to look at him. What about me? He stood slowly, steady now, and crossed to her. His hand rested lightly on her hip. You already have everything I can build. She leaned into him, her breath warm against his neck. Then don't ever stop. I won't. His lips brushed her forehead. Not ever. Outside, the snow thickened across the pasture. Inside, the fire burned low, and the quiet wrapped around them, not empty anymore, but full of time, of promise, of the kind of love that grows in slow, steady inches alongside the seasons. By March, the earth had begun to thaw in places, loosening along the edges of the pasture where meltwater ran in shallow rivulets. The orchard trees stood bare, but Della had begun pruning them with a small saw Merritt had loaned her, moving slowly down each row while Zadie napped in a basket just within sight, bundled in flannel and shaded by a wide-brimmed hat pinned with a ribbon. Larsen worked nearby, laying fence rails to square off a section of land for planting. The days were longer now, though the morning air still bit through wool. One afternoon, Della paused between branches to stretch her back and saw Larsen standing at the far end of the field. His shirt sleeves rolled and his weight leaned into the post driver. He didn't see her watching, but something in his posture, the ease of it, the steadiness tightened a thread in her chest she hadn't known was still loose. She set the saw down and made her way to him, her boots soft on the thawing ground. You've got a gift for making things hold, she said. He turned, brushing soil from his hands. Not much use if they don't. I used to think the only kind of strength that mattered was the kind you could see, she said, but this what we're building, it's something different. Larsen looked at her, then at the field stretching behind her. You trust it now, she nodded. I do. That evening, while Zadie slept in the cradle beside the stove, Della sat at the table sorting through a pile of cloth scraps. Larsen brought in a crate of seed potatoes and set it beside the door. "Where'd you find those?" she asked. "Traded with the lanes out past the ridge. They had more than they needed." She picked up a square of calico and ran her thumb along the edge. "You think this land can hold a real garden, if we work it right," he said. "And if the roots take." She stood then, walking to where he stood removing his boots. "We've both done some wandering," she said, "but I don't want to any more." He straightened, meeting her eyes. "Neither do I." She lifted her hand to his cheek, her fingers warm from the fire. "Then let's stop wandering." He leaned down and kissed her, slow and sure, like something they'd both been carrying a long time and could finally lay down. In April, they tilled the earth together. Merritt, still strong despite his limp, broke ground with a borrowed plow while Larsen guided the mule. Della planted early onions and hardy greens, her hands stained with soil, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. Zadie sat in the shade nearby, gnawing on a carved spoon and watching the motion of her mother's hands. By summer, the swing hung from the oak tree out front, just as Larsen had said it would. He'd carved the seat himself, smoothing the edges with beeswax and fitting the ropes with knots tight enough to weather wind. Della sat in it one afternoon, Zadie on her lap, and let Larsen push them gently, the creak of the ropes mixing with the rustling leaves. "You ever think we'd have this?" she asked. He stood behind her, hands resting on the ropes. "I didn't know what I'd have, but this is better." She tilted her head back against his chest. "I want to teach her how to read under this tree someday. You will, and maybe play music. If we can find a fiddle. I'll keep an eye out." She smiled, and he leaned down, brushing his lips against her hair. The wedding ring Larsen gave her that fall was simple, made from a gold coin he'd once carried for luck. He'd taken it to the smith in town and had it melted down, reshaped into a band just wide enough to hold an etching. A small oak leaf, no larger than a fingernail. She wore it always, even when kneading dough or scrubbing linens. Zadie took her first steps the following winter, wobbling from Della's arms to Larsen's boots with both of them kneeling close. Her laugh echoed against the walls, bright and high. Merritt built her a small stool for the kitchen so she could reach the table as she grew, and each night they all sat together 3 generations, quiet and whole, years past. The orchard bore fruit again. The soil grew soft under their care. Della taught children to read in the parlor during the colder months, and in spring she and Larsen planted in rows, side by side, hands black with earth. Zadie ran between them, her braids flying, her laugh rising like a bird startled from brush. They never left that land. Larsen built a second room onto the house when they needed more space, and Della stitched curtains dyed with elderberry. On warm nights, they sat on the porch and listened to the crickets, their hands always finding each other in the quiet. They grew old there, but gently. Nothing in them broke again. They had lived through the sharp edge of loss and found each other where the world had gone quiet. And in that quiet, they built a life that held. When Zadie grew tall and strong with eyes like her mother's and a spirit like her father's, she planted her own garden beside theirs and said she'd never live anywhere else. And they believed her. Because when the roots take, they do not let go. And love, when grown with care, carries through every season.